Welcome back to the M&A Science Podcast. This episode is part 2 of our conversation from last episode. If you missed part 1, I recommend giving that a listen first. Otherwise, let's pick it up right where we left off. That's a new power and lock.
Yeah.
I still do this today. I have that same outreach. And I usually what I try to do is like frame a problem that I'm trying to solve.
Mm-hmm.
You know, growing a startup, there's always something like, hey, I'm doing my first VP of sales hire. We're trying to, scale this new function out and trying to figure out what's the best structure and something to reach out to CEOs. I got a sense you've sort of been there, done that.
Yeah.
And the more precise or targeted for, I need help with this specific thing, I've had a really good response rate, and I still continue to use that as a lever for
throw out the question. I'm sure you have an opinion of fill in the blank.
Yeah, it's like I have a sense you may have experienced this.
Well, and it's interesting because if you start asking the right questions and listening the right way, you clue in real quickly into kind of the care-abouts that someone has, and you just start asking like the simple questions. And the next thing you know, they're talking for another 20 minutes, and you're learning a lot from them.
We sort of mentioned a couple things. Like I talked about just direct LinkedIn, which I'm a huge fan of.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you go global with that, and then there's events.
Yeah.
Which I think is an important one. Are there any other avenues that you found pretty valuable? The other thing, there's a flywheel you create, because when you meet people, there's a way you can get referrals or other intros without being obnoxious about it.
No, I think, I think, I joke, and I think I might have been like an early adopter of LinkedIn, maybe back in like 2003 or 2004. I think I got an email once and it was like, congratulations on being a member. You were member number like 10,432.
Oh, wow.
Something ridiculous like that. But like I've always appreciated just the general sharing of knowledge that like that platform has afforded M&A practitioners. Whether it be, celebrating the wins of people in your network or others who have done, big deals, small deals, difficult deals, what have you. I think I always like hearing someone, celebrate their team and the people they worked with on, hey, we announced this or we closed that. I think that's really great. And I also think it's, having the humility to sometimes, there's different groups out there where it's like, hey, I've got a problem and I don't know how to solve it, but I'm sure someone else has done something similar and I'm here to learn. And kind of that ideation and thought partnership and discovering that, okay, someone else has dealt with that before. Someone else has helped solve it maybe in a different way. And here's how I need to think about it for my situation. But I think there's a lot to be said in just getting back to the basics of like meeting people in person, developing a relationship, developing, an interpersonal connection that, just hiding behind your laptop or your keyboard just doesn't get you. And so, that's why I've always enjoyed going to conferences. In the Bay Area, we've got a couple different groups that get together quarterly or every, twice a year, just to kind of exchange notes and share and commiserate, celebrate. And I think that's valuable because the work that M&A is, it's not easy. And, sometimes there's situations where you're like, I don't wish this on anybody. So there's some lows. There's also some incredible highs where you just feel like you're invincible. You don't want to do too much and go cause bodily harm. And that's a different podcast to tell you about all the injuries I've had in my body over the years. But, I think I think there's a, I'm glad we're coming out of COVID. I'm glad, it feels like we're starting to get back to, human interaction. And tangentially, I think a lot of organizations are trying to figure out, how do they strike that right balance with, bringing people back to work to be successful versus the efficiencies of maybe, some hybrid work or working remote. But at the core of, who you are and the work you do and the connections you make, it's super valuable to, I think, make those one-on-one connections.
Hey, I got to ask you one, because I don't have experience working in a large organization like you do. Networking within the organization, because oftentimes I'm boggled by folks I meet and they don't do that. They almost
so that boggles me too, because I ran into someone at this event who worked at a company I had formerly worked at, and I just casually asked, "Hey, who's running this part of the business or that part of the business?" They didn't know. And I was like, head scratching, like, how do you not know? Like, you should know, right? But finish your question.
Well, the pattern I've recognized is when I've seen, we had the person on here. He was the Baxter CEO, Harry Kramer. We had Harry Kramer on here, and he came in as like finance associate to CEO track.
Just grew up through the company.
I've seen the partners in their 30s, but the common element was networking extremely well within the ranks.
Yeah.
And then also being able to solve their boss's problems better than their boss does. Those two things like will lend you to a high level of success within a large organization.
Yeah, so like networking doesn't just happen because you're here and just like, hey, look at me, come network with me. Like you have to have some purpose around it. So I think you have to, put in the action to go network versus being the receiver of networking. I joked, my kids played athletics, and I would always joke with them, especially when there were situations of physical contact. I'd say it's better to be the hammer than the nail. And my son knows this very well because the one time that he was the nail, he broke his wrist. Playing soccer, it was a 50-50, and they came together shoulder to shoulder. The other guy just came in with a little more intent. Son went down, put his arm down, and wrist got broken.
Okay.
So he learned his lesson, and it was interesting because he learned that lesson when he was maybe 13, and to watch him play, high level club competitive soccer, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and that hammer mindset. Oh, it was like just he was tearing kids up. I had other parents that were screaming at this kid, at my kid. I'm just kind of like, yeah, he's the hammer. But I think you have to go out with intent, right? Like large organizations, can be, so big that people just don't know where do I start? Like who do I start with? Where do I go? Do I start at the top of the organization? Well, that person may not have any time for me, or do I, aim for the middle? So I think, as you're thinking about maybe some strategies in larger organizations, okay, well, who do you work with right now that perhaps has been there for a while and they've got a network, and it's kind of like, kind of that additive, it's almost like a logarithmic kind of like, network to network, and it's exponentially, like next thing you know, you're within like, two people who can get you to the expert who does X, Y, or Z, and you reach out and you start networking with that person. So I think it's a bit of the art of how to leverage those around you who know others to get to what you want to learn or who you want to reach out to. And sometimes it's just being like, look, I have an interest in this, or I have an interest in that. How do I get there? And people will say, oh, you should go talk to Julie over there. She did this for 5 years, but she's been in her new role for 2.
I think that's a really good point. There's sort of being in the conversation where you're really listening, you're really trying to learn from a person's experience, and just keeping your mind in that listening mode, so active listening. But then there's also a point when you got to share where your goals or what direction you're trying to go. Yeah. Just so that's clear. And that's where that lends to more of those purposeful referrals and introductions without being like forceful.
Not feeling like you're kind of salesy, kind of, like
when you do that, you build real rapport, and then a person they want to generally help you out. Yeah. They kind of put that extra effort in because, and two, it's just interesting how listening to people, sometimes you help them work their own issues out just by.
Yeah. Or sometimes in the conversations, you find yourself articulating something and in verbalizing it, hearing and getting some sort of reaction back for it. You almost sometimes accidentally solve your own problem without even knowing it.
Exactly. Yeah. So those are great on just the networking approach. What about the thing I really struggle with right now is maintenance. I feel like even now,
maintenance is tough.
I mean, do you go through your network and start stack ranking it and say, hey, this is the most, the one, you try to do that, but then that evolves over time depending on what you're doing. And then there's, do you create a cadence for staying in touch with folks that, hey, this person's on my once a month, once a quarter, once a year, and see you when I see you? I
mean, you and me, like I went dark on you for a long, long time because of how busy I was, and unfortunately that was the case. But you do bring up a good point. I think maintenance is really, you have to be really purposeful, I think, around maintenance and and remind yourself that you do need to do some sort of maintenance. I mean, imagine, like I see how much enjoyment you get out of bringing your daughter on the podcast and her contributing.
We got to go hang out with you.
But imagine if you treated, let's say, view your relationship with your daughter differently, and instead of her being your daughter, she is a colleague of yours in the industry. Now imagine if you didn't engage with her for 3 months. That just feels really distant. It's like, oh my dear, if I detach myself as a parent, like that just feels wrong. Right. So I think like it's interesting because like you can think back to people friends, people in your network, and you can be like, hey, I can call up this person, and within 30 seconds, like it's like no time has passed. Like those are really special, and I think you have to have. You can't be absent in focusing on maintaining your network and staying in touch with people. And I'll be the first to say that I know I can do a better job of that. And interestingly enough, there was a period of time where I was getting to work on my bike. I commuted to work on my bicycle. Enjoyed it, the fitness, dodging cars, not trying to get injured. But you know what was something I missed was actually being in the car and pulling up the phone and being like, I haven't talked to so-and-so. I'll give them a ring. And just some of those ability to just have that time to make the connections. And I think that's really important. And there's other ways that we can kind of maintain the network, whether it's drop them a text, just say, hey, I was thinking about, like, I just contacted someone that I hadn't talked to in 2 years, and I saw on LinkedIn that they had gotten promoted. And I gave them the thumbs up, congrats on LinkedIn, but I actually got on my phone and said, hey, congrats. We should go grab coffee. It's been a long time. And I think a bit more intent and keeping that front in mind. I know I can do a better job. And I think a lot of people struggle with that too. Cause like you'll have that interaction and you'll hear the other person say, I'm so glad you reached out. I've been meaning to do this too, or I've been remiss. And so there's a human connectivity thing that I think you can't forget. It's not. We're not all trying to get the biggest network on LinkedIn. We're trying to get an ecosystem that is there to support us, to help us grow. We contribute into, they contribute into us. I think it's much more multifaceted than just a number.
Back in the day, I'd have Friday afternoons were pretty open, and I would just call people. It's fun. It's like a friendly prank call. You just kind of joke, There's people just call them out of the blue.
Not a Shadur Sanders phone call.
But it's like a nice surprise. You're just like, hey, what's up? I just want to call and give you shit.
Hey, good to talk to you.
But now I don't have any time anymore.
We need like an AI bot.
Yeah, they're actually trying to do one. They're using like Delphi AI, and they're trying to make a bot of me and feeding all the podcast transcripts. But I don't know how that's going to work. Well, I'll let you know on that.
We'll have bot-to-bot conversations in the future.
Oh, when I had one of the VPs in the company, we had a disagreement on some different views on something, and I ended it with both of us sending AI responses to each other. I'm like, this is like we have AI for our argument, and I'm like, oh, this.
You're using conversation GPT, and he's using I'm going to yell at you GPT.
Yeah, I'm just like, I don't like where this is going. This is I like that in terms of the maintenance approach. Networking, definitely the most underrated, undervalued skill. So highly encouraged to put some reps in towards that. What I do is I tell the up and comers 30 minutes a week, just go on LinkedIn, connect with folks, and try to book intro calls, and use that as your just muscle to keep building networking.
Yeah, and I think here's why I'm reaching out to you. Like, your background interests me in this or that, like some sort of little hook.
Keep doing it. You'll get good at it.
Yeah.
Well, hiring.
Yes.
I want to learn from you. You built a lot of teams, successful teams. I've heard so much praise at Marvel, particularly. Like, people are always like, you want to go learn M&A, go see what they're doing over there at Marvel. And you were too busy doing deals to talk to me when you were at Marvel. So I was just curious, in general, a big part of it is just getting the right team working together. If we can talk through, what do you look for when you bring somebody to your team? How do you spot somebody with real potential? And is that true at Marvel? Was that really like they were doing things right over there?
They had, so they had gone through a period of change where they brought in a new leader. He brought in his new leadership, and that opened the door for them to turn the business around and start doing some acquisitions. And I think what was interesting, I was not there for the first acquisition that they did, but there was so much positive momentum around how it worked and how it added value and benefit to the business that it kind of created a flywheel effect. And that the effect kind of, naturally kind of carried into the subsequent deals. And that was a model that was a bit more of kind of the National Guard, no real dedicated quote team except for a couple of us. But we had some outside assistants that would come in, some consulting assistants that would help. But you had people within their areas that really enjoyed, doing the extra work it took to do M&A work. And I think, in those instances, they all recognize that, hey, I've got my day job and I've got my, integration job, or I got my job that I'm doing, diligence and, other work to kind of suss out, is this the right thing? And I think, in those instances, people enjoyed flexing up to participate and help. And it was really great to see.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
So you sort of got a culture where they were bought in and wanted to lend a hand. And
they were bought in, and there was it was a culture of, hey, I know that maybe someone else on the team would do good if I could bring them in and they could, get some exposure, some apprenticeship around this, and almost be a backup to me, or end up being the rock star of the group. So. It's fun to see how momentum around deal work shows up differently in different organizations and how they're structured and what they're trying to accomplish.
How do you hire the best?
I don't. I think it's there's no magic formula to it. I think, I've had my own personal missteps and seen good deals, bad deals. And I think I see in myself personal traits that if I would have, it's kind of like, I can't put my finger exactly on what good feels like, but I can trust my gut because I know what bad feels like. And I've had enough good experiences. I feel like I know what good feels like. And it sometimes just comes down to sometimes intangibles of just, how does someone handle themselves in the interview? How are they able to articulate their background? I'm a big fan of behavioral interviewing. Tell me about a situation when you did this or that. And some of the foundations of behavioral interviewing is that past behavior is a good predictor of future behavior. So, if I get in the course of an interview and I understand, some of the things that you did, I can then maybe throw out some hypotheticals to say, okay, well, how would you think about this situation? Or how would you think about solving this problem? And it may not be a problem that is specifically tied to the role that I'm hiring for, but maybe it's a question that highlights something I mentioned earlier around, I'd like to see leadership at all levels of the team. So maybe it highlights, something there, or highlights, hey, look, we're high area of ambiguity. How do you break that down? How do you think about that? And I'd say what's really underrated is, it's difficult to do this work when you have a mindset of that's someone else's problem to go solve. And kind of feeling like, this is the box I work in and this is all I do. There's so much to be done in M&A related work that if a candidate just shows that willingness to be like, I'm open to doing more, or I'm willing to do something that maybe I'm not the expert in, but I'm willing to learn and I'm willing to grow. Like that means a lot to me because there's always going to be more work than there are hands. And if someone can feel comfortable with taking on something that is going to give them growth, going to learn, maybe they don't see it in the moment, but you see it in their background that you're like, you know what? If they were put into an opportunity that they may feel is a little difficult for them to kind of step into and execute, but you've seen, how that work can play out and perhaps the growth that can be had from those experiences. I think that's pretty valuable. And, I think you have to, you can't typecast people you can't typecast candidates who want to get into M&A because they want to get into M&A because there's something about it that intrigues them. And like I said, it may not be for them. They may do one deal and be like, this is not for me. That's okay. But there is some reason why they're intrigued by it. And so, discovering through conversation, through interviewing, like why is that? Like what about it? I see the wrong answer would be, well, I just want to do deals. Okay, well, tell me more, like, why do you want to do deals? Is there
solving problems? It's something,
right? Like get to those deeper, inspective kind of introspective points, that show up in an interview that gives the hiring manager or the hiring team a better sense of really like, okay, we know who this person is. We know how they're going to show up. We see why they want to do this. And I think that's important.
So how well they can articulate their background, and then you're sort of looking at some of this historical behavior and just to anticipate what the future would look like. And then ownership and their drive, what's driving the drive. Those are the main things.
I mean, those are pretty important to me. And I think, humility, like you can't come into doing this kind of work thinking you're the expert that knows everything. I mean, I'm always learning something new. I've told my team if I'm not acting that way, please tell me and slap me on the wrist. And I do feel that over time, as you've had enough experiences, you start to develop, kind of a trust your gut feel. Like,
that's true.
That doesn't feel, and I've had some interesting conversations with peers who, if you think to trades in the past, like I'm thinking like in the 1500s, 1600s, like a blacksmith. Okay. Like you just didn't become a blacksmith and start producing the best swords in the world for the Knights of the Round Table. Like you learned your trade. And so I think there's a bit of apprenticeship that is valuable to just recognize that that's important in this kind of work as you get exposure, as you do different kind of deals, as you learn from different problems that are solved. One of the things that I know we'll get to, what's something that you wish someone would have told you earlier, and the one that always I come back to is there is a ton to learn from the journey that you're on, and don't get distracted by the destination you want to get to. Destination is a great goal to it's your North Star. I want to get over there. I want to do this, or I want to achieve that. That's great. But don't let that be like blinders on you to being present in the work you're doing today, in the work that is coming up tomorrow, to not learn from the journey. I can think back to a couple times in my career where I got a little too myopic on that destination. And there was so much more I could have learned from the journey if I just had my older self kind of, slap me upside the head and say, Todd, learn from the journey.
I totally agree with that. I learned the exact same thing. It's just like performing in the present.
Yeah, be present, be in the moment. Yeah.
Is there anything you do to quantify a candidate, like test projects, business case, sort of stuff like that?
I've seen people do things like that, hey, let me give you a problem. Let's come back in 3 days. I'd like to, have you write something up, see something. I've never subscribed to a lot of that. I think just over the course of the conversation, I get a sense of, what a person can accomplish. There's not a bar that I'm looking for them to hit. Now, that being said, I'll share an old story. When I was doing Oracle work, I did use some technical code, and I would hand it to a candidate. And it was about a page, and it was written in PL SQL. And I handed it. I said, can you help identify what the problem is in this code? And not everyone would know. And that was informative to me because the code itself, it was recursive. It kept calling upon itself. So, it would be the equivalent of us watching us on video and then, just kind of being in an endless loop of you or I saying the same thing over and over and over. And you want to just like hit the side of the television or, slap your laptop monitor, like, skip forward. Right. That was probably the one time where I got some pretty technical with something. And I actually busted that out with a friend who was interviewing for a role, and he got so upset that I put him through that.
Oh, that's so funny.
He was really upset.
So that's interesting because I always thought it's good. I always try when I do any kind of role hirings, some kind of test project or some trial, something.
I mean, maybe it comes out in the way I do some of like the behavioral interviewing and just kind of the flow of the conversation of, speaking in some hypotheticals and seeing how people kind of handle that in the moment.
I think it's different too because you sort of are looking at different roles and different background and professionality or an earlier stage company. Pick out kids right out of school.
Yeah.
It's like, I need to see if you can jump over this fire pit and this, if you can do the job there real quick. Okay, so I want to flip it where I'm somebody that wants to come work for you.
Right.
Big shot guy at Intel. Let me,
I'm just Todd.
I don't know that. I just saw your title. So, and then I don't come from this ideal background. I think that's my biggest concern is, I've been in maybe like a customer success role, something that's a little, there, but not super recognized being associated with M&A. But I'm just really interested. I read the headlines. I kind of learned about it. I've heard, when our company talks about doing stuff like that. But now I'm transitioning and looking for a new role. And I want to figure out how do I get in? How do I position myself to stick out? And
so what are some of the common problems that you see in your current role in dealing with customers and how they interact with our business?
They're always
I'm presuming you and I are in the same organization right now. Okay. Or let's do it like it's a large organization and you're...
Hey, the biggest thing is we get a lot of angry customers to deal with. And the thing is it's turning around their experience.
And in turning around those experiences, are there common themes or are there common techniques that you've found that are really useful to kind of getting a win-win for people?
There's a couple of key questions I'll ask just to get to the root of their problem. Like I really want to understand what's irking them.
Okay.
And I found that more than half the time people just want to be heard out. If they get heard out, they calm down. It gives us a lot of time. If we don't hear them out, they lose their stuff and they'll potentially blow up and they try to escalate it and start bugging the executives.
So how do you handle those situations where perhaps maybe you don't have the answer and you say, look, I want to give me 24 hours. I'll come back to you with something more tangible. How does that work and how do you think about that?
I just want to make sure I've had enough depth of conversation that they truly felt they've heard and that I've taken enough context.
Yeah.
So they got details. I don't have to come back for them for more specifics. And then usually by that time they've put enough detail, they felt that they've been heard. They're sort of emotionally calmed down. And then it's my work to go get some feedback from the tech folks and see if we can resolve this problem and how long it's going to take.
And in articulating what you just did, do you see that would be valuable in aspects of M&A? Like how are you thinking about that?
To be honest, I don't know that much of like how it works. I know it's just interesting projects and it just seems like more complex. And I think that's what drives me interest in it is just solving things that are more of a complex challenges.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Time. Meaning time. Let's stop role playing.
Hey man, that's like maybe I was about to make up.
No. So where I was going with the line of questioning was I was trying to get a sense of like how do you deal with situations where you don't have the answer and maybe you need to go find more things. How do you listen to the customer? How do you enter into that dialogue to learn a little bit more? Like my mind in our conversation immediately went to maybe an aspect of being involved in aspects of like diligence and like, hey, I've got a time to go. I get to sit down with someone at the target, and I get to listen to what they do and how they do it. And maybe with my experiences and background, I know that it's done a little differently. So let me tease out some aspects of, asking some other probing questions to get a better sense of like, how do they think about this or how do they think about that? Like that's a skill, and just like being engaged and listening that, serves a lot of M&A professionals really well.
So that's how I would link it back to, this is why I'm interested in this role.
Yeah.
As a sort of discovery that I'm already doing with the customers would apply pretty well.
Yeah, totally. And your background, your hypothetical background of dealing with difficult customers is also can be valuable to, not every person who you engage with in an M&A deal wants, is excited about the outcome. You sometimes hear you'll hear people say, well, yeah, my company is sold and that wasn't my idea. I didn't buy into that, or no one asked me if that was good. So, you run across, various emotional responses to deal work. If you were to take a customer experience, customer service background and be like, okay, I've dealt with happy customers, I've dealt with upset customers. How do I, really get to the heart of the problem, defuse some of the emotion, in the room and get to the facts?
I say there's sort of two views of know myself and just understand what my role is. Because sometimes you don't think about it. You're just you're doing it day to day and you don't think of what you're actually doing.
Yeah.
That, hey, I'm actually doing a lot of discovery conversations with these customers. Then I think this goes back to even the networking. Use the networking approach to connect with folks in M&A roles. Just, hey, openly I'm really trying to pivot into M&A. Love to just learn from experience.
Yeah.
And just try to get more of their language of how they describe what they do, so you understand how you sort of position that story of, this is what I do, this is how it applies to M&A.
And the great thing about networking is you may articulate and have a background that you're talking with somebody, and they may in their own network be like, oh, I know someone over that organization or that company that they had that same background that you did, but they did it 15 years ago. I should get the two of you connected.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable. I think just having some intent is, and getting it on the table to talk about, opens a lot of conversations and doors.
Totally. I just had that yesterday. I was like, one of the guys on the round table is going through a take private. And it's like, well, I know two other people that just did that in the last few years. You should probably go talk to them.
Yeah, go have coffee with them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's how I would approach that, is sort of position myself of how this fit would for the role. I'm curious about, there's this evaluation of looking for folks for full-time hires, and then you got consultants that you bring in as well.
Yeah.
Is there a different way that you evaluate those experiences, or do you not get a crack at it? Somebody just hire the consultants because they know somebody higher up and you just have to work with them?
No, I mean, I think sometimes it comes down, you got different organizations who want to make the investment. So sometimes they might, run a team a little more lean, and augment that with consulting when they need to flex up. Or then you've got, larger teams who maybe, when there's not as much active deal work, those people are putting their skills and skill sets into other programs and activities within the business. So I can say with full confidence, I've worked with a lot of great full-time people. I've worked with a lot of great consultants. I sometimes joke that, anyone in doing M&A is one job away from doing consultant, and anyone who's a consultant is one job away from being a full-time employee doing this kind of work. So I think, I think there's a lot. There can be a lot of fluidness around that. It kind of comes back to I've worked well across aspects of teams built, in one regard or the other, and it does come back to hey, are you a team player? And can you lead? And in other instances, I didn't mention this, is can you follow? Because I think, sometimes people get enamored with I've got to be the leader. I've got to, I got to show leadership. Well, there's also times where you've got to, hey, I've got to follow someone else, and I've got to be there to support them in their own leadership journey and their leading that they're doing of something critical in how I'm part of that. Like I go back to my Stanford basketball example. You come into college, you know, I was lucky enough to play high level Division I college basketball. And I remember coming in the locker room and looking around the locker room going, you know, at one point, every single person in this room was probably the captain of their own team. And now it's like, okay, how are the dynamics of who we are in this room going to play out so that, you know, who are the leaders, who are the followers, how does that kind of transcend the locker room? You know, there's commonality around, well, you know, it's the juniors and the seniors, the guys who've been here a long time. But every now and then, like, you get just, you know, someone who comes in and they might be the freshman and it's like, we're following you. You're our leader. And I learned a lot, I think, about how to be a good team player, how to be a follower, because it was evident to me that, like, you know, I was not the star athlete of the team. I didn't jump the highest, didn't run the fastest, didn't shoot the best. So I said, how can I be the best teammate? How can I contribute? How can I, you know, ensure that the collective success of who we are maximizes everyone's capability around the table? So I think there's an aspect of knowing how you can contribute when you need to be the follower in the room, and how you can step up and be a leader when you need to be the leader in the room. I think that's important. That's
a really strong point. You do got to do that balance of sort of knowing when to lead and when to follow.
Yeah.
I was thinking buyer-led M&A. I get a royalty, by the way. I get like $1 every time I say that.
Yeah, you got it trademarked down here. How did that happen?
You know, we trademarked it, and it's just we sort of published a framework around it, and I'm actually working on a book, but really putting all these themes together on driving deal from the buy side. And it's just where we see the puck going the next 10 years. That companies are going to be more proactive about leading from the buy side. And it goes back to what you mentioned earlier of just connecting diligence to integration, really putting that thinking in the forefront of the deal process. And you got to do it proactive. It's a seller-led process, and you're going to figure out integration after you close. It's not going to work. And we just see it. And I feel like this is like the fabled failure rate, right? 70 to 90% of deals fail.
Okay, so that's a point I haven't brought up. I sometimes think that's a bit of, here's my theory. I think and I'm happy to have anyone push on this and say, Todd, you're completely wrong. But I have a theory that there's a subset of M&A practitioners out there in the market who have done M&A really, really well over the years. But they're not the ones who are going out and saying, look how great we are. They just go about their business. They buy companies, they integrate, the value shows up, and they move on to the next one. And I just have this theory that they're kind of in the shadows just doing really, really good. And they don't need the visibility of like the look at me. Whereas you get this data point, and I'm sure there's research out there that I've seen it too, where you're like, 80% of deals don't return on, the value that was intended when it was agreed upon.
Why are you going to sell consulting services on a low failure rate?
Well, no, that's the thing. It's kind of like I'm going to sell my services just based on the fear that it's based on fear. So I just
okay. Here's my view on it. The question is, what is failure? Because it's not
that's a really good question to ask.
My theory is that people tend to overpay for a deal because, especially if you're buying a competitive, banker-led process, you're going to overpay for it. The winner is going to overpay, and then you're scrambling to make up the value. So at the end of the day, hey, the target was to hit X revenue or X, integration within 1 year.
Yeah.
And it takes you 15 months.
Right.
But still a failure.
True.
You know what I mean? Like
If you understand where the goalposts are.
Yeah, you'll still get there. It's just going to take you longer. And I feel like that is actually most of the failure, versus an AOL story or something. Like it doesn't completely tank. And then we work with a lot of roll-ups, and those like pragmatic acquirers, they got a strong hit rate. If you look at their fail rate, it is like well below 10%.
Yeah. I think like part of it goes to, your point is kind of like, okay, when the deal was done, the goalposts were, at the end of the end zone. Well, okay, something happened in the business, maybe something changed, and now the goalposts are now 20 yards to the right. They're not in the middle of the field. Okay, someone either move the post, they move my cheese, you name the analogy, but there was a dynamic that changed. And then you go back, you go, well, did it really hit the original value? Did you hit it?
But no, to get the deal approved is like you got to inflate all your synergies to like get the goalposts up here, and then reality strikes, but by then it's on your plate. It's like bye.
Yeah. That's why you don't see very many deal people who continue to carry the charge through doing the integration work. They're happy to hand the baton over.
You see them when you're hungover after closing dinner, and it's like, hey, Todd, good luck on this.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, my buyer-led question.
Fire away.
Buyer-led M&A is all about building strong, aligned teams early. How do you think about building a team that's set up to win post-close, given what we just talked about?
So I think you really got to have a tight understanding of kind of what is the end goal. And sometimes that does take a bit of, poking and prodding, from the integration side of the work to, kind of, be a bit of the friction in the room to kind of say, okay, well, is it, are you really looking to, is success really around, a market adjacency? Is it really around maybe some product synergy? Is it around, geographic expansion? So kind of, what is the definition of like, what does good look like, or what is the win? What is the win? And understanding that, there could be many different routes to get there. And I think it's important because those routes to get there are going to be informed partly by what part of the business is doing the deal. If it's a big enough business that there's, multiple business lines, some of the aspects of the dynamics of how that business works per se. And then also, the characteristics of the target. Are there things that are, so visible about the way that target operates and works that you have to take that into consideration and be thoughtful around it. So if it's perhaps a very strong engineering organization that is, very critical of high product quality and technical capabilities, and that's coming into maybe someone who in an organization that maybe is, hey, we'll take a little more risk. We're okay with moving a little faster and knowing that we've got to, maybe do a patch here or a patch there after a release of a product. That might, you got to suss some of those dynamics out.
Those are good points. I don't even think about that. I'm just like, who are the best people? But it's like looking at the whole scenario.
Well, full disclosure, like you say buyer led, and I'm thinking, okay, well, let me put my hat on about seller led. Have I ever been on a seller led kind of journey? And I think to myself, no, I haven't. And here's why. Because I came up through the integration route, and the integration route was always tied to, I'm the buyer, I am receiving, I am buying something that's coming to me. I as the company have to figure out how to make it work.
Well, by the time you've screwed up enough deals, you're going to set up an integration function, and then and at that point, and that's what happens. I notice like first deal is usually like that. You don't think about any of this stuff.
Yeah.
And then around deal 10, then it's like, whoa, their whole process is very much led on the buy side.
Yeah. I think that's true because you start seeing that there's probably some power in understanding as a organization, why do we go do deals? How does that kind of, it's almost like your DNA. Like how does a deal fit into our DNA? How does it become successful? Because you could have two competing targets out there that both on the surface look good, but you click into it and maybe let's use culture as an example. Could be two completely different cultures, and you realize we are going to work better and integrate quicker with this culture versus that culture.
That's going to be a big,
Could be something like that.
So I like that. It's not just looking, here's like people for their characteristics. We're looking at the whole picture.
Yeah.
What's end goal going to look like? What is the characteristics of the situation? Engineering focused culture, top down, bottom down management, whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. So we got a great team. We did a bunch of great deals. People eventually get bored. This is an interesting question because this comes up on these roundtables of, hey, I've been in corp dev. I got to the top, a VP level title, whether in the integration focus or the deal focus. What's next?
Yeah, it's a good question to ask because I think sometimes you can fall into the trap of you enjoy this so much that you just never want to leave. And it's more so you don't want to leave the kind of the thrill of the work. You may,
That's what usually happens, right? You do a deal and you run away, or you stick around for a long time.
Yeah, you stick around. You're like, something must be wrong with me, but you enjoy it, right? Like there's that thrill to it, and I think you see that. I've got people in my network who've been doing deal work at one company their whole life, or I have folks who have done it across many different companies. But like I asked myself this question once, and I thought to myself, you know what, if the question was posed, you can never do M&A ever again, what would you do?
Go do a startup. No, I wouldn't do a startup again. Take that back. I would try to find like a management, like a GM in a company, like running some business division.
You're very close to how I was thinking about it too, which is in the work that you do, whether it's, I think, regardless of whether you're doing it on the deal side or the integration side, or you got a foot in both, you get a tremendous amount of exposure across a lot of different areas. And I don't think it's easy. Some people may have given this thought and said, oh, I'd immediately want to go focus, maybe, be a COO, or I want to be a CFO, or I want like people may have taken that thought or taken time to think through that. But I think it's valuable for people doing M&A work to like take the time and like step back and go like, you know what? I don't want to give myself any credit and say, oh, Todd's on something, but like, just think about like, if I couldn't do this work, what would I go do? And I think I look at it and say, there's a tremendous amount of just cross-functional experiences and exposures that you have. And sure, you may not be a deep expert in everything that you've been exposed to, but you're going to find that as you think about it, there might be some aspects that you gravitate towards. Like I had someone pull me aside and they said, man, I really like how you think about culture and communications, transformation, that employee experience. You were acquired, you knew, you've gone through it yourself. You sometimes, put the shoes on that others are going through, and you would be really good in like a senior HR role. I had never thought of myself in that capacity, but that was interesting. That was an observation that I was blind to, just thinking about myself. But I think, it's valuable, to kind of check out, take some time, give some thought to the experiences that you've had. Cause I think you can I think you can make an argument. I think people doing this work, if they step back, they can make the argument to aligning themselves to their next step because of some exposure they've done through M&A, and something where it's like, you know what, I remember that deal. I had to dive deep into, some aspect of legal operations and privacy. I could really see myself getting deep into privacy. It's an interesting space. So I think I think there's a lot of different, there's different on-ramps in M&A. I think there's a lot of different off-ramps.
Yeah, I like that. That there's a big theme around just cross-functional in nature, which opens up a lot of different management leadership roles. One I just popped in my head was the private equity operating partner, or going to private equity like portfolio support, operating support, whatever they call it. That's another one that you're seeing like continually emerge and get stronger.
No, I think there's some interesting aspects of, if you were to take someone who's had frontline M&A experience and, could you, how would you position that in being, additive to a private equity's portfolio of companies? These companies may have the need for, some M&A experience or expertise, but maybe not a full-time person, but, hey, you're my investor. Can I lean on you? And do you have someone with experiences in this? Or take the other side of the spectrum of, a venture capital firm who, we haven't seen as many IPOs, we haven't seen exits, but you've got firms that are really mature that are out there, that perhaps are looking to do their first deals and, working with, let's say you're on the payroll of a VC company, but your services were, you were like an internal consultant to all of their portfolio companies who were and two different ways I think about it, like who want to go do M&A or who are thinking of M&A as a viable exit because they've maybe reached the arc of where they think they're going to get to.
Yep. Prepping them for an exit.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of different avenues and things that you can think about if you just take pause and just give yourself a sense of time to think through it.
Worst comes to worst, you can become a consultant again.
You can always go back to consulting.
I don't remember the consultants. There's some great consulting firms out there.
There are, and it's always great hearing, working with consultants and hearing their stories from different clients. Now, clients protected. They're not, I respect, not dropping names or not dropping client, but just sharing the story. Like I had a client, and here's what happened.
Absolutely. Hey Todd, I got to ask one thing. What is the craziest thing you've seen in M&A?
So a couple things, and they're very specific.
I like how you thought about this.
And you know what? I wrote these down.
The thing is, if anybody's listening, we interview so many people at big companies. So like our process, we have to send an outline so we get comms approval. Because I can't, surprise you with this question.
Yeah.
But let's hear it.
Well, it's funny because I would say if I were to listen back to our recording, I've kept what I need to keep private and confidential and just referenced a situation or a story.
Shout out to all the comms people out there. I love you, appreciate you, especially the ones that are easy to work with, not the ones that turn me down.
So there was one integration where we were doing a weekend move and a small engineering team of maybe like 75 people, and they had a kegerator. And over the weekend, we snuck that kegerator into the acquiring office, and I think we put it in a network server room. And so, on Fridays when you saw engineers walking out of the server room with red Solo cups, it was because of the kegerator. Some other stories. I did find myself a while back. I had a phase of my athletic journey where I played some hockey. I found myself in Europe during the dead of winter, and I actually traveled with my hockey skates and had a fun time just visiting local rinks. There were a lot of outdoor Christmas rinks. That was a lot of fun.
Oh, that's so cool.
But there was one where I think it could have been the size of 2 football fields. It was huge. So I felt really bad for that unfortunate beginner who was drifting to the middle, and there was no wall to hang on. And they look up and they realize they're 100 yards from.
Done, yeah.
Yeah,
they're crawling.
They might have had some people out there helping, kind of like retrieving them back or some way to get back to safety. There was probably the one that hit the hardest was I was working on a deal, and I had a critical conversation on one phone, and then the second phone rang, and I forgot to put the first phone on mute. I had the second call. People on the first call were like, "Get off the line," and I realized after the fact that how big of a mistake that was.
Oh boy.
Yeah. I went back to all parties and admitted my mistake, and we worked through what really transpired. Like, did it really impact what we were doing? And learned a lot from that. That might not have been the craziest thing, but it was probably the one that taught me one of the biggest lessons. Yeah.
Make sure you hit the hold button.
Hit the hold button. Or just don't
get off it. Don't answer.
Just drop the call.
Just
say, sorry, I have to take this other call. I'll get back on.
That's true.
Yeah.
I've had similar things happen.
Yeah.
Everybody has.
Yeah. Even telling the story, I've got a little PTSD.
All kinds of crazy things happen when it comes to these deals.
For sure.
One of these days, we'll go back out for drinks and get more crazy stories.
Yeah. This has been fun.
Todd, this has been a great conversation. I want to thank you for taking the time.
No, my pleasure.
Become a better M&A scientist here.
Yeah, and I really enjoy the content that you put out there. I try to listen to as many podcasts and the YouTube content that's there. It's fun learning from others, fun hearing their stories, and thank you for all the stuff that you do to help the community.
If you're still listening, fellow M&A scientists, thank you for staying tuned this far. I'd love to hear from you. This is a little switch up on the typical podcast, but we wanted to get something a little broader for folks that are more of the career transition, whether going in or looking for the next thing. So I hope you had fun listening to it. Love to hear your thoughts. If you liked it, what you liked about it. If you hated it, what'd you hate about it? I'll take the criticism so I learn to get better. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. Until next time, here's to the deal.